is the difference between internal, external, and terminal ballistics? Well, I'm here to explain that to you. The internal ballistics has to do with the bullet's behavior prior to exiting the muzzle of the weapon. The external ballistics is the way that the bullet behaves as it exits the muzzle and just prior to hitting the target. The terminal ballistics is the bullet's behavior upon hitting the target, impacting it. Once it impacts, the way that the bullet acts is how that determines the terminal ballistics. Determining the angle of impact when a bullet hits something is determined by taking the bullet hole measurements, which for example, let's say is 0.45 inches. We then measure the bullet hole length and find that it's 0.9 inches. The sine of the angle of impact is the hole's width divided by the hole's length. So 0.45 inches divided by 0.9 inches, which equals 0.5 inches. And this would be the sine of the impact. This is the sine of the angle of the impact. We need to determine the actual angle of impact. So in order to do that, we need to use the inverse sine. So on a standard calculator, scientific calculator, you would hit the inverse and the sine button, and it would put like a -1. And then you would use that to determine the inverse of the arc of the sine of 50.5, and that would give us the angle of impact at 30 degrees. The smaller the angle of impact, the larger the hole. Generally, the width of the hole determines the caliber of the projectile. These different projectiles will be left with distinct marks on them. Rifling marks are what they are called. The barrel of the weapon has certain grooves and lands in it and on the inside, and it's like a fingerprint to the bullet. And once it fires through the chamber, the lands and the grooves leave marks on the bullet that are very distinguishable. The bullet will also have a firing pin mark, leaving either a rimfire hit or a center fire hit on the bullet or the casing, so this way you can determine which weapon it was fired from because they're all unique. When using a revolver, it contains a cylinder to hold the cartridge, whereas a handgun has a magazine. The revolver can be broken down into 2 actions, single action and double action. When the 6 bullets are loaded into the cylinder of the revolver, a spring-loaded hammer is positioned on the other side of it, and the primer explodes. It ignites the propellant, which sends the bullet down the barrel. Determining what happens at a shooting scene, we would use a scientific method. The scientific method is used to come up with the conclusion as to what happened at a shooting scene. You must first question what is wrong and come up with the hypothesis. We know there was a shooting. Was it a suicide or a homicide? You make a prediction as to what happened. You will then need to perform a series of experiments to determine whether or not your hypothesis is correct. So you may have to work through different experiments in order to come up with the actual answer. You'll, for instance, which direction the bullet came from. You could use lasers, trajectory rods, depending on the scene. And then after analyzing the problem, you'll conduct the experiments and you'll come up with your conclusion based off of your evidence. And you may have to rework sometimes if your answers do not reach your question. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.